Go ahead. So first of all, I want to say thanks to Prof. Lisa Looney, who kicked off the idea for this event and has now moved on to greater things. And also our current prof of the faculty, Brian Corcoran, who's the acting dean in the Faculty of Engineering and Computing. I also want to thank Anya Nolan and Christine Steers, who've been working away at the background on the logistical and marketing side of things and social media. And I want to welcome my co-host, Fiacre, from the Institute of Ethics and School of Theology, Philosophy and Music, DCU. So this year, it's a joint event between computing and his school, which is fantastic. So as I said, we're now recording. Only the host will be visible in the recording. You guys should keep your sound muted and video off. And all questions that you ask should be through the Zoom Q&A tool. And so now there, Brian is just appearing. So he's our speaker for today's talk. And so it's Dr. Brian Davis, School of Computing, DCU. He's an expert in AI and natural language processing, and also with great experience in European projects. And he's going to share some of this experience with us now today in his talk. So Brian, I'm just going to hand over to you now. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing. So hopefully you can start to share. You're still muted.
1 second now. I'm just going to enable that for you. Okay, so.
And thanks again to all the subscribers today. We have great attendance. Okay, Brian, over to you.
Okay, Rob, thanks. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I really appreciate it. It's a great opportunity to talk about a project that I coordinated back in between 2015 and 2018. So I'm going to talk about managing social media data in the context of EU research projects, ethical challenges and solutions. So really this is a case study with respect to a European project that I coordinated. So a little bit about the project, which is Social Sentiment Financial Indexes, it was called SSIX. And it was in a Horizon 2020, it was an innovation action that was funded under the H2020 Research and Innovation Programme, ICT 2014. And long story short, without going into too many technical details, the goal was to create actionable analytics from structured and a combination of unstructured and structured content. So okay. Apologies. I'm going to just use the term artificial intelligence. It's probably it's a term that you hear an awful lot, but what we were focusing on was a very bespoke sentiment classifier. And if you're not familiar with sentiment analysis or opinion mining, it's the idea of mining usually unstructured sources for attitudes or opinions, whether somebody liked something or didn't like something. And the idea of SSIX was to focus on social media that was discussing financial products initially, but the goal was to generalize beyond that. And it was inspired by the finance sector, which was concerned with something called volatility indexes, which basically tried to measure the predictions with regards to buying or selling financial products in the future. So stocks, for instance, but we were looking at event detection as well and named entity recognition and combining that with sentiment analysis. And we were looking to do that in a multilingual fashion, not just English language, but other languages. The business use cases were obviously finance, news analytics, and sales lead generation and competitor analysis. So briefly, the consortium at the time, I was working at NUI Galway, and the consortium was led by the SFI Centre Insight. I was the coordinator, and we had one partner that managed data, a data management partner from Italy. We had a company, Lionbridge Technologies, that was supporting us with regards to natural language processing, that we had expertise ourselves, but also multilingual NLP. And we had RedLink and University Take Passau, who are also supporting us scientifically, RedLink from the point of view of processing large amounts of content. Peractin was concerned with the financial use case. Handelsblatt Research Institute as well were a pilot partner, and the media company Euractiv were concerned with communication dissemination. So I'm just going to bring you through the workflow and focus in on the ethical challenges of the project. So we can just very high level, we have our workflow of data management, artificial intelligence, NLP core, and then analytics. So data management would be, I suppose, effectively ingesting any of the social media. We're predominantly looking at social media data. We could take data from established sources such as information from financial indicators or APIs. We had our AI NLP core that was basically processing the content, normalizing it, processing it, extracting out opinions, assigning them to particular targets, which could be stock or companies. And then we had this also involved processing other languages. And then we had the analytics, which was basically building indexes and so sort of trying to build prediction scores based on the content that we'd extracted out from text and creating visualizations. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but just to keep you focused on the ethical challenges. So the ethical challenges we identified. Now, it's important just to be aware at the time when this project was funded. So we're talking about starting in 2015, the GDPR hadn't come into place. So there was a certain scramble as such across the board to anyone working on EU projects of how to make your data management and data ethics compatible with the GDPR. So very much in the context of this, public versus personal data was a gray area for us. So we were mining publicly available sources, even if sourced from an official API, they could be considered personal, in that the public data might contain some personal information. And most importantly, the author of the tweet, for instance, we were also using another microblogging platform called Stock Tweets, which was specific to financial experts or traders. They would use a specific platform. The point is they may not have been fully informed or made aware that their data was going to be transmitted or used by a third party without their knowledge or full consent. When I say full consent, even if they signed the terms and conditions of Twitter, they may not have been made fully aware of how that data would be processed by a third party. There was also the challenge of filtering. We needed to identify spam accounts, and this required deeper analysis or storage of Twitter user data. And this could be interpreted as profiling. At the time, profiling was something that was being flagged in the GDPR, and we were being cognizant of what degree of profiling we were going to do or what we could do or could not do. But the important thing here is failure to remove spamming would contaminate our data set and our experiments. So this had to happen. So we were going to have to store some kind of personal data. There was also along the actual AI side of things and the processing of the content for NLP purposes, language processing purposes. We were looking at reputation and influence scores. From social network analysis, such as using APIs or automatic means of accessing score data from, say, a provider like Clout. Now I'll come back to Clout again, because it's quite an interesting example. But Clout was basically trying to sort of profile users social media users' reputation. So if you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram or you're on Twitter, these sites were being mined as such to generate a cloud score. And we were considering adding that into SSIX at the time. So the goal here was also generating, we were also interested in generating a sort of a weighted sentiment by targeting experts in the financial domain. You may or may not be surprised, but sometimes sort of financial experts in the case of the financial use case would tweet their opinion about a particular stock or product, and they were very much that tweet would or opinion would carry an awful lot of influence or weight, and we wanted a way to sort of bring that in as well. So again, this could be interpreted as profiling. And then in regards to the analytics, again, it came back to the aggregation and generation of these social sentiment indexes. So these various scores for visualization and using social network analysis sites, particularly, for example, the one I gave about cloud, sort of a gray area there, and aggregating sentiment from expert groups. And again, this all could have been interpreted as profiling. So what were the actions taken in the project? Before the grant was signed, we had, at the time, I think it was a strong point in the proposal, was that we proposed an ethics board. It's called a Data and Business Ethics Board, but just for clarity purposes, I think the business term is sort of relates to the fact that it was an innovation action, and very much the consortium was industry focused. It composed of a representative from each consortium partner and 3 independent experts. One was a lawyer based in Germany, Karsten Kinnast, and he was also an external data protection officer for many companies. And he was he was recommended to us by our German partner Handelsblatt at the time. And NUIG, we were able to bring in the expertise of Heike Felsman, who was a lecturer in philosophy at NUI Galway, and then Helen Lepel, who was part of, who had been a member of the Press Association in the UK, had expertise in privacy. So she was the 3rd expert. And they would meet twice a year, and they helped us design and an ethical framework, which was established along ethical principles, which the project should follow. So, so we had basically the following ethical principles were developed in the project. They may seem kind of standard today, but at the time, these were quite, when it came to review time, it was quite novel in the sense of what we were trying to achieve. And we had strong controls all along the data chain: collection, storage, analysis, and aggregation, and disposal were paramount to success. So privacy first approach did not have to be difficult, but we followed the principles below to ensure that we stayed on the right side of the law, so to speak. So first was just to be ethical, and really to be sort of the notion of empathy, and to think about, well, how would you feel about it if it was your personal data, or personal data of a family member, for instance? How would you like it to be processed, or how would you feel about where it was being transmitted after you published it? Just to be clear and transparent with regards to the personal information you're collecting and how it is being used and why you require it. And the why you're collecting the data, and the why should be something that consumer actively wants to get involved in. Respect data provenance and integrity. Privacy does not end with the click of I agree, and consumers need to be able to trust that their data is being used appropriately, and that they can retain control of its use. Respect the social network's terms and conditions of service, and ensure that user controls such as delete propagation are in place. The other here is aggregate and anonymize. So very often you can avoid any kind of disclosure of some personal information from public social media sources like Twitter by aggregating the data and anonymizing it. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then obviously we had protecting minors, because obviously children cannot provide any kind of direct and informed consent. Or their parents' permission is required, but that wasn't an issue here. So just a summary of the data ethics issues identified within the scope of the platform. So we have actions with respect to privacy and security, collection and storage of data. So SSIX collected publicly available data from social networks, blogs, and news providers. And we only collected data from publicly available sources. And this means, in principle, all relevant authorizations and consent shall have been provided by the owners of the data. And I'll come back to Twitter and that. But for the judgment of user consent from social media accounts, our ethics board views user acceptance of platform terms and conditions as consent to the usage of their publicly available data. At the time, though, our ethics board acknowledged that this was not an ideal. And what we did is, which was quite innovative, and we got great praise in the review, was that we offered users a blind opt-out from SSIX data collection, and I'll come to that. So SSIX fully complied with the terms and uses of all social networks it intends to collect data from. And this means effectively we were focusing on Twitter data, and there are certain terms and conditions with what amounts of Twitter content or how much Twitter content you can redistribute and in what way. For very large amounts, you have to redistribute the Twitter ID, but not the actual tweet content. But you can also distribute small amounts of raw tweet data or tweet data that has been enriched with its metadata. It's changed a little bit since then, but still the terms and conditions are in place with how much you can make available publicly and in what ways you can share it. And this isn't always adhered to still to this day. With regards to collection storage, we abided by each social network's developer policy and developer agreement. So I just mentioned that there, basically about sharing on or publishing content. We did not use any social network which had weak policies. And when I came back, when I mentioned about Clout there, Clout was at the time was an up and coming company. It was we felt that it could add a lot of value to the kind of work that we were doing by sort of weighting the opinions that have been pulled out from Twitter or stock tweets at the time, by adding in this reputation score. But it wasn't very transparent with how Clout were collecting their data. And so our ethics board at the time just said, avoid a social network that has sort of dubious policies, and we backed out from including it into the platform. And not long afterwards, about 2018, Clout was effectively shut down. So that was a really good example of following the advice of our ethics board. The next point is where data are not publicly available, or if specific authorization was needed, relevant informed consent would be obtained before any collection or use of processing of relevant data. And we provided social network users a blind opt-out from data collection via the project website. We strove to maintain the highest level of anonymity for all individual users in our work, keeping only the data which was essential for the project's objectives. We destroyed all personal data. It was no longer to be used for the project's purposes. And we developed a clear policy about disposing of personal data. We did not share any data sources gathered for research outside of the project team. The only exception was with regards to the Open Research Data Pilot. So if you're familiar with H2020 products, you sign up to the Open Research Data Pilot, and so your whatever your data sets that you've been used for training your machine learning algorithms, they would be typically shared out through this mechanism as well as your papers. And obviously, any data that we shared, we were making sure that we were adhering to the terms and conditions of the data provider that we collected them from. I'll come back to anonymity as well. All information was gathered. We kept all information gathered confidential in secure password protected servers. Obviously, that is standard practice. And all of this was documented in our data management plan. At the time, we created one data management plan in month 6 and then updated it every 12 months. And if there's any changes to the data sets. Regarding identifiable user data, we did need to store some identifiable user data for filtering and categorization, but the following details were not used, such as name, address, age, sex, any photos, date of birth, and metadata. So data quality was of fundamental importance to the project. So strong filtering rules were needed due to the prevalence of bots, fake data, and spammers, etc. So data such as a user ID was required to remove spam messages. We were looking at keeping user profile description in order to classify some users into a domain category, such as a Twitter user who declared themselves as a financial analyst or stock analyst or trader, but we didn't actually implement that at the time. But that was something we were considering, and that would have sort of moved into the area of profiling. Another tip was general data was kept to categorize users by location, but location detail was no greater than the regional level. Okay, so we could categorize users, but only at the regional level. So we weren't focusing down to more detailed levels of location. The final analytics of, so one action here is in relation to business ethics and how the aggregated metrics were going to be used. So we gathered all this data in and we'd indexed it, and we're going to visualize it. Well, how is it going to be used? So the data was aggregated, okay? So we did not target any one particular user. We were considering group data, but this was only high-level domain grouping from certain professional fields, such as analysts or stock traders, but we didn't actually implement that in the end. The project had no plans of identifying, and it did not identify individuals or build up a profile on individual users, or we did not aggregate users across multiple social networks. And that was very important, that we weren't building up a profile of a user. And the reviewers at the time in year 2 were concerned what level of profiling, if any, we were going to engage in. So the project did not discriminate on any sensitive grounds. Just in relation to your research outputs, so this isn't, so in this case, it was, yes, it was actually regards to data sets. So we did not ever directly quote individual users without their informed consent, okay? But where informed consent could not be obtained, as it's the case of social media, we presented the content of messages in aggregate forms, such as topic clustering or word clouds and themes. So contextualized examples and descriptions of the meaning or tone of the message of content. So these forms of representation precluded the identification of individual users and preserved anonymity and confidentiality. So the general tip is aggregate and anonymize in order to avoid accidentally disclosing any personal data. So I'm just conscious looking at time here. So a full anonymization trace was impossible for us, okay? So that was something that was discussed in year 2 of the project by the reviewers, whether we would have full anonymization. We needed to keep some user data for the need for filtering. So we wanted to remove any spam, filter out bots or fake data. And if we were looking at categorization of traders or analysts from regular users, but most important, it was really the filtering. The data quality was of critical importance for the project outcomes. Otherwise, all our experiments would be corrupted as such. So we needed to store some identifiable user data, such as user ID and profile description, but we didn't save name, address, age, sex, photos, date of birth, etc. And I mentioned that as well. Some local information was kept, but no greater than the regional level. I'll move on to informed consent. So with regards to any of the project marketing, so any of the newsletters, any mailing lists, there was an opt-in on marketing, the project newsletter. And if you wanted to access any of our data sets or gold data sets, they required an explicit opt-in before the project sends any correspondence to a user by email, and a record was kept of the opt-in. Obviously, with respect to social media networks, users already provide a sort of an opt-in or provide consent for the possible transmission or usage of their personal data via onwards to or by a third party. But we couldn't achieve a true opt-in or a double opt-in. And this would have required contacting every user on Twitter, asking for permission to collect and analyze their public messages. And this request in itself would have constituted spamming. So it would be impossible for us to even have achieved that, except for Twitter itself, in order to get a true opt-in in relation to Twitter users. And I'll come to the solution that was proposed to us by our ethics board in order to circumvent this issue of not being able to get full informed consent for processing social media content. So we had a consent manager, which provides a solution for using a blind opt-out. So basically, we had a privacy page was also added along with the consent manager, explaining what data was being collected and what was being done with that data. So on our project website, we had a SSIX consent manager, and we had specific opt-out applications that for Facebook and Twitter that you basically would connect specifically to the Facebook and Twitter platforms. No information was stored by the process, so you didn't want to store any personal data as a side effect of the process. Excuse me. There was a web form which, using the provided form, you could send a custom request, and the user would just insert his or her email and type a message for a specific request. When the request was made, it generated a new issue in the SSIX consent manager and our project management workflow, and it was assigned to the ethics board. And once the request had been completed, the issue was deleted. The other issue was on that we encountered with regards to our privacy page and our consent manager was we were recommended by the reviewers of the project just to ensure that the language that we used in the privacy page and the consent manager was clear and unambiguous. There should have been no technical jargon or specialist jargon, no ambiguous verbs, even anything that would be somewhat vague. So for example, the project does not want to do anything discriminating, the project will not. So subtle little adjustments there. And then I'll come to finally towards data ethics in SSIX with respect to disseminating privacy and data ethics in SSIX. So one of the problems that we had was obviously we couldn't get any consent from anyone on Twitter. As I said before, we couldn't email or contact every Twitter user, and it wasn't even possible. So we proposed this blind opt-out. But the question was, how were we going to raise awareness of the blind opt-out? And it was actually one of it was Heike Felsen at the time who recommended that we use our dissemination channels to raise awareness of our consent manager. So We created a blog post about the consent manager. It was disseminated on all social media channels by Euractiv. Any future changes to the consent manager were updated, and a new posting was published on all social media channels. The project brochure and flyers were, if we were presenting at conferences or any project events, they were published printed on all the material in a very prominent place. So it wasn't sort of something in a corner in the project flyer. It was put in a very prominent place. And that was something, a small tip by the project reviewer, but was to ensure that on the project website, that the privacy section was very easy to find and quite visible, as opposed to typically privacy information is sort of bundled up in a corner somewhere and not viewable. So we have an example here of disseminating our privacy page and our consent manager on Twitter. And we have our sort of consent manager button there. And this was on our Facebook page at the time, and on the project website. So the consent manager could have been accessed in two ways: from the top menu under the privacy section, and from a very prominent button with links on the front page of the website. So it goes back to my point of making sure that it has a very prominent and clear place for the user. Okay. I think I've covered this, sorry. Aligning SSIX with the GDPR. So the GDPR came into effect on the 25th of May 2018, and we were coming into our final review. And in year two, we were very clearly told to the best of our ability to ensure that the project was compliant with the GDPR. So as I'm sure you're all aware, the GDPR brings data protection laws into the 21st century, taking into consideration the data privacy and security threats presented by today's technology. And we had a specific section on GDPR in the project's knowledge base. And the key points were that we presented in our final review was how SSIX basically complied with the GDPR, aligned with it. And what we had is the theme of consent and Article 7, GDPR conditions for consent. So we had an explicit opt-in for project marketing, which was good practice, and the SSIX consent manager for social media data, and they were extremely happy with that. And obviously, because we had tried to disseminate it through our social media channels to raise awareness of it. The right to be forgotten, Article 17, we had our consent manager and also our blind opt-out as well. And a few social media users did actually use the blind out option. So word did get out through our social media channels. And privacy by design, Article 25, which was our data and business ethics board, created at the proposal and grant agreement times and the ethics reports and the description of work. We didn't have our own dedicated ethics work package. A lot of proposals now have their own dedicated ethics work package. What we did is we injected a task into the project management work package, which had 3 annual reports on data ethics. There were some open questions, and still are to a certain degree, of we presented this, was that organizations that process personal data for research purposes may avoid restrictions on secondary processing. I'm not a lawyer, just a disclaimer here, as long as they implement appropriate safeguards in accordance with this regulation. So there's sort of a recital 50 there. If you go here, I just found this was a very good website. And the GDPR adopts a broad definition of research, and for us it was unclear exactly how far the GDPR's research exemption would extend, but it did support research and innovation as long as organizations implement the appropriate safeguards. And there's a news article that's still published now, and it's still quite valid, which talked about that at the time. So basically, to sum it up, the project did meet the standards of the GDPR, even though it hadn't come into force at the time, and that we had done the best to the best of our efforts to adhere to the GDPR while awaiting implementation back in 2018 of national legislation. And our data and ethics business, our data business and ethics board were satisfied that we were complying with the GDPR. And obviously, one thing we had to clarify is that every partner post-project who was using the platform or any of the technologies would be responsible for ensuring that they were in line with the GDPR. So that's the presentation finished. I hope I'm in good time, Rob. Not too bad.
Very much, Brian. That's great. Still super relevant topic for all of us that are researching and using data. How do we make use of social media data? Still key. So one question that